The photograph should have never existed. In a sterile hospital room in Caracas, a woman sits propped against white pillows, her head completely bald, her once luminous skin pale and drawn from chemotherapy. But her eyes, those same eyes that had captivated judges at Miss Universe 2001, burn with an intensity that no crown could ever match. This is Eva Ekvall, former Miss Venezuela, and she is dying. More importantly, she is refusing to die quietly. The camera that captured this moment wasn't wielded by a fashion photographer seeking to immortalize beauty. It was held by Eva herself, documenting her own destruction with the same fearless precision she had once used to conquer pageant stages across the world. The image would become the cover of her memoir, Fuera de Foco, Out of Focus, a book that shattered every convention about how beauty queens were supposed to behave when the spotlights dimmed and real life began. This wasn't just another celebrity memoir filled with glamorous anecdotes and diplomatic thank yous. This was a death sentence written in real time, a love letter to her infant daughter, and an indictment of a society that worshipped physical perfection while remaining terrified of emotional truth. Eva Ekvall had spent years being photographed, but this would be the only image that truly mattered. The moment when a beauty queen chose authenticity over aspiration. The world had known Eva as the stunning Venezuelan who had represented her country at Miss Universe, whose smile could sell products and whose presence could light up any room. But the woman in that hospital bed was someone entirely different. A mother fighting for more time, a writer documenting her own mortality, and a human being determined to transform her dying into a form of testimony. Within months, that photograph would be reproduced in newspapers across Latin America, shocking readers who had never seen a beauty queen without makeup, without hair, without the carefully constructed perfection that the pageant industry demanded. Some would call it exploitation. Others would call it courage. Eva called it the truth, and she was willing to die for it. But to understand how a woman who had everything the world said should make her happy, beauty, fame, love, and motherhood, could face death with such brutal honesty, we must travel back to the beginning. To a young girl in Venezuela who learned early that beauty could be both blessing and burden, who discovered that winning could feel like losing, and who would spend her entire adult life searching for something more authentic than applause. The story begins not with a crown, but with a question that would haunt Eva Ekvall her entire life. If you can be anything you want, why does everyone only see what you look like? December 15th, 1983. Eva Monica Ana Ekvall Johnson was born in Caracas into a Venezuela that was obsessed with beauty in ways that other countries could barely comprehend. This was a nation that had produced more Miss Universe and Miss World winners than any other, where beauty pageants weren't just entertainment but national religion, and where little girls grew up believing that physical perfection was both achievable and necessary for success. Her mother was Swedish, her father Venezuelan, and Eva inherited a genetic lottery that would shape every aspect of her future. The kind of bone structure that photographers dream about, the height and grace that pageant scouts identify from across crowded rooms, and the natural charisma that makes strangers want to follow wherever you're leading them. But she also inherited something less visible and more complicated. A restless intelligence that couldn't be satisfied by admiration alone. From her earliest childhood, Eva displayed the contradiction that would define her entire life. She was stunning enough to stop traffic, but smart enough to understand that being stopped for your appearance was both powerful and profoundly limiting. While other beautiful children learned to trade on their looks, Eva seemed almost frustrated by the attention her appearance commanded, as if she knew instinctively that being valued for beauty meant being reduced to a single dimension of humanity. Her early years were spent navigating the particular pressures that came with growing up gorgeous in a culture that treated female beauty as the ultimate achievement. Teachers expected her to be vain or stupid or both. Other children's parents made comments about her appearance that were inappropriate and uncomfortable. She learned before she was 10 that her face was public property, subject to commentary and analysis by strangers who felt entitled to opinions about her physical development. But Eva was also developing interests and talents that had nothing to do with her appearance. She was a voracious reader, particularly drawn to journalism and biography, fascinated by stories of people who had used their platforms to create change rather than just accumulate fame. She wrote constantly, poetry, short stories, journal entries that revealed a young woman trying to understand her place in a world that seemed to value her least important qualities most highly. The pressure to enter beauty pageants was enormous and constant. In Venezuela, suggesting that a girl as beautiful as Eva should compete in Miss Venezuela wasn't just an idea. It was practically a civic duty. But Eva resisted, not because she was opposed to competition, but because she understood that pageant success would lock her into a very specific kind of life, one where her intelligence and ambition would always be secondary to her ability to look perfect in a swimsuit. Could this early awareness of beauty's limitations have been what eventually gave her the strength to reject conventional expectations, even unto death? Her teenage years brought the full flowering of her beauty, but also the full weight of the expectations that came with it. She was scouted by modeling agencies, approached by pageant organizers, and constantly reminded that she was wasting her natural gifts by pursuing education and journalism instead of leveraging her appearance for fame and fortune. But Eva had begun to develop what would become her defining characteristic, an almost pathological commitment to authenticity that made her incapable of performing versions of herself that felt false. She couldn't giggle on command, couldn't pretend to be less intelligent than she was, and couldn't summon enthusiasm for things that bored or offended her. This authenticity was both her greatest strength and her most significant liability in a culture that rewarded women for being whatever men wanted them to be. The decision to finally enter Miss Venezuela in 2000 wasn't born from vanity or ambition. It was a calculated choice made by someone who understood that pageant success could provide a platform for the kind of journalism and advocacy work she actually wanted to pursue. Eva had watched other Venezuelan beauty queens leverage their crowns into meaningful careers, and she believed she could do the same while maintaining her integrity and independence. But she also understood the risks. Entering the pageant world meant submitting herself to a level of scrutiny and objectification that she had spent years avoiding. It meant allowing her body and face to be evaluated by judges who would reduce her to a collection of measurements and statistics. It meant performing a version of femininity that emphasized beauty and charm, while downplaying intelligence and complexity. The preparation for Miss Venezuela was both physically and psychologically demanding. Eva had to learn to walk in high heels without appearing to concentrate on her balance, to answer interview questions without sounding too intelligent or too political, and to project confidence while remaining humble enough not to intimidate the judges or threaten other contestants. She was being trained to be perfect, but perfection, she was learning, was another word for artificial. The night she won Miss Venezuela 2000 should have been the culmination of every Venezuelan girl's dreams. Standing on stage in a sparkling gown wearing a crown worth more than most people's houses, Eva had achieved something that millions of women had attempted and failed. She was beautiful enough, charming enough, and strategic enough to convince a panel of judges that she deserved to represent her country on the world stage. But even in that moment of triumph, Eva felt the strange emptiness that would haunt her throughout her pageant career. She had won by successfully performing a version of herself that was both appealing and utterly superficial. The judges had fallen in love with her appearance and her ability to deliver practiced responses to predictable questions. But they knew nothing about her thoughts, her ambitions, or her actual personality. From beauty queen to beauty queen's shadow, Eva had gained a crown but begun to lose herself, and the real contest for her soul was just beginning. The transition from Miss Venezuela to Miss Universe contestant was like moving from a local theater to Broadway. The stakes were higher, the scrutiny more intense, and the pressure to be perfect more unforgiving than anything Eva had previously experienced. Suddenly, she wasn't just representing herself or even Venezuela. She was carrying the hopes and expectations of an entire nation that had invested its identity in beauty pageant success. The months leading up to Miss Universe 2001 were a masterclass in controlled dehumanization disguised as preparation for stardom. Eva's diet was monitored and restricted, her exercise routine choreographed and supervised, and her public appearances carefully scripted to maximize appeal while minimizing the risk of saying anything controversial or revealing any aspect of her personality that might be deemed unmarketable. But what troubled Eva most wasn't the physical demands. She was disciplined enough to maintain whatever standards were required. It was the psychological cost of constantly performing a simplified version of herself. Every interview required her to be gracious but not opinionated, intelligent but not intimidating, confident but not arrogant. She was being systematically trained to be forgettable in every way except physically. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was preparing to compete in a contest that supposedly celebrated female achievement while being coached to suppress every aspect of her identity that actually qualified as an achievement. Her journalism experience was reframed as a hobby. Her political awareness was sanitized into vague platitudes about world peace, and her intellectual curiosity was transformed into practiced responses about wanting to help children and families. The Miss Universe pageant itself was both more and less than Eva had expected. More in terms of pure spectacle. The lights, the costumes, the global television audience that transformed every gesture into a potential career-defining moment. Less in terms of substance. The competition that was supposedly about finding the most accomplished woman in the world ultimately came down to who looked best in evening wear and could deliver the most diplomatically inoffensive responses to soft-bail questions. Eva's performance was flawless and utterly hollow. She advanced through every round, charmed every judge, and represented Venezuela with the kind of grace and beauty that the pageant world valued above all else. When she was announced as the fourth runner-up, the crowd erupted in applause for someone who had successfully hidden everything interesting about herself in service of an idealized version of femininity that existed nowhere in real life. Behind all that glamour and global attention was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw. The aftermath of Miss Universe brought opportunities that should have felt like victory. Modeling contracts, endorsement deals, television appearances, and the kind of celebrity that opens doors throughout Latin America. Eva had achieved everything that the beauty pageant world promised. Fame, fortune, and the power that comes with being recognized as one of the most beautiful women in the world. But success in pageant terms felt increasingly like failure in human terms. The offers that flooded in were almost exclusively based on her appearance. Companies wanted to rent her face to sell products. Television producers wanted to rent her beauty to attract viewers. And photographers wanted to rent her body to create images that had nothing to do with her thoughts, feelings, or experiences. More troubling was the growing recognition that her pageant success had actually limited rather than expanded her opportunities. Casting directors and producers saw beauty queen and assumed she was decorative rather than functional. Publishers and editors saw Miss Venezuela and assumed she couldn't write or think analytically. She had gained global recognition but lost professional credibility. become famous but somehow less qualified to pursue the career she actually wanted. The depression that followed was as predictable as it was devastating. Eva had achieved everything her culture told her should make her happy. She was beautiful, famous, and financially successful, but she felt more isolated and inauthentic than ever before. She was surrounded by people who wanted to be near her beauty while remaining completely uninterested in her personality, her thoughts, or her aspirations beyond maintaining her appearance. The crisis deepened when she realized that she had become complicit in her own objectification. She was accepting modeling jobs and endorsement deals that reinforced exactly the kind of superficial standards that had made her miserable. She was using her platform to sell products and lifestyles that she didn't believe in to women who were struggling with the same pressures that had nearly destroyed her own sense of self. The decision to step back from traditional beauty queen activities and pursue journalism wasn't dramatic or well publicized. Eva simply began declining the most lucrative offers, and instead accepting positions with newspapers and television stations that would allow her to use her intelligence rather than just her appearance. She was choosing authenticity over income, substance over celebrity, and truth over the carefully constructed lies that the beauty industry was built on. But the transition wasn't easy. Editors and producers who hired her often expected her to cover fashion and lifestyle stories rather than serious news. Colleagues sometimes struggled to take her seriously, assuming that someone who looked like Eva couldn't possibly have the analytical skills necessary for investigative reporting. She was fighting not just for professional respect, but for the right to be seen as a complete human being rather than just a former beauty queen trying to prove she had a brain. The journalism work was both satisfying and frustrating. Satisfying because she was finally using skills that had nothing to do with her appearance. Frustrating because she constantly had to work twice as hard as less attractive colleagues to be taken seriously. But she was building a body of work that reflected her actual interests and capabilities, creating a professional identity that went beyond the crown she had worn for a single year. It was during this period of professional rebuilding that Eva met John Fabio Bermudez, and for the first time in years, she experienced what it felt like to be valued for something other than her beauty. Their relationship was a revelation. Here was someone who was interested in her thoughts, her ambitions, and her personality. Someone who saw the crown as just one small part of a much more complex and interesting person. Marriage and motherhood brought new forms of fulfillment, but also new pressures. Eva was determined to be a mother who valued substance over superficiality, who would teach her daughter that intelligence and kindness were more important than appearance. But she was also aware that her own struggles with beauty standards and public expectations had left her with psychological scars that could affect her parenting. The birth of her daughter Miranda was both joyful and terrifying. Eva was overwhelmed with love for this tiny person who would grow up in the same culture that had both celebrated and destroyed parts of her mother's identity. She was determined to create a different kind of life for Miranda, one where beauty would be appreciated but not worshipped, where authenticity would be valued more than perfection. But even as Eva was building the authentic life she had always wanted, meaningful work, genuine love, and the profound satisfaction of motherhood, her body was preparing to betray her in ways that would transform her final years into the most important work she had ever done. The lump was discovered during a routine self-examination in early 2010, when Miranda was barely a year old. Eva's first thought wasn't about her own mortality. It was about whether she would live long enough to see her daughter grow up, to teach her the lessons about authenticity and courage that had taken Eva decades to learn. The diagnosis of breast cancer at age 26 was devastating, not because it threatened her beauty, but because it threatened her time. The initial response was everything that Eva's journey toward authenticity had prepared her to reject. denial, desperate optimism, and the kind of positive thinking that prioritizes comfort over truth. Her family and friends encouraged her to stay strong, to think positive, and to focus on getting better rather than acknowledging the possibility that she might not survive. The medical establishment offered treatment options wrapped in statistics and hope, but nobody was willing to discuss what dying might look like or how to prepare for it. But Eva had spent too many years fighting for truth to start lying to herself when truth mattered most. She approached her cancer diagnosis with the same journalistic rigor she had brought to her professional work, researching treatment options, understanding survival statistics, and asking the kind of direct questions that made doctors and family members uncomfortable, but that she needed answered to make informed decisions about her remaining time. The decision to document her cancer journey wasn't born from narcissism or a desire for attention. It was a natural extension of the journalism career she had built and the commitment to authenticity that had defined her adult life. If she was going to die, she wanted her death to serve some purpose beyond grief, to offer something valuable to other women facing similar diagnoses or struggling with their own relationships to truth and mortality. The book project that became Fuera de Foco started as a series of journal entries intended to help Eva process her own experience, but it gradually evolved into something more ambitious. A completely honest account of what it felt like to be young, beautiful, and dying, written by someone who refused to sanitize or sentimentalize the experience for public consumption. Did this tragic event mark her downfall? Or was it simply the tipping point that revealed the depth of her courage? The writing process was both therapeutic and excruciating. Eva was forced to confront not just her mortality, but also the ways her pageant career had both empowered and damaged her sense of self. She wrote about the pressure to be perfect, the isolation that came with fame, and the strange relief of finally having a problem that couldn't be solved with better makeup or more disciplined eating. But she also wrote about love, the overwhelming love she felt for her daughter, the gratitude she experienced for her husband's unwavering support, and the unexpected love she had discovered for her own complicated life, cancer and all. The book was becoming a love letter to imperfection, a celebration of authenticity even in the face of death. The decision to include photographs of herself during treatment was the most controversial aspect of the project. Eva's friends and family were horrified by the idea of publishing images that showed her without hair, without makeup, and without the beauty that had defined her public image. But Eva understood that these photographs were the most important part of her story. Visual proof that a person could lose everything the world valued about them and still be valuable. The photographs weren't meant to shock or seek sympathy. They were meant to document truth. Eva bawled from chemotherapy, Eva weak from treatment, Eva holding her daughter with arms that were bruised from IV needles. These were images of someone refusing to hide from reality, even when reality was ugly and frightening and completely at odds with everything she had been taught about how women should present themselves to the world. When Fuera de Foco was published in 2010, the response was immediate and polarizing. Some critics accused Eva of exploiting her illness for attention, of trading on her former beauty queen status to sell a sensationalized story about cancer. But others recognized the book for what it actually was. A revolutionary act of honesty in a culture that demanded women suffer prettily and die quietly. The book became a bestseller throughout Latin America, not because people were fascinated by celebrity illness, but because Eva had written something that no beauty queen had ever written before. The complete truth about what it felt like to be human in a world that valued her humanity least. She had used her platform not to sell products or promote causes, but to offer something much more valuable. Permission to be real. The final year of Eva's life was spent promoting the book and using her remaining energy to advocate for cancer awareness and research. but more importantly, it was spent being the kind of mother and wife she had always wanted to be. Present, honest, and completely focused on love rather than image. She was modeling for her daughter a way of being female that had nothing to do with beauty and everything to do with courage. The irony of her final year wasn't lost on her. She had never been more beautiful than when she was dying. Not because of any physical attribute, but because she was finally completely herself. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? Or do some people simply learn to illuminate those shadows so brilliantly that darkness becomes light? The final months of Eva Ekvall's life were spent in a strange space between private mortality and public testimony. The success of Fuera de Foco had made her cancer journey a matter of international interest. But Eva approached this attention with the same commitment to authenticity that had defined her response to beauty queen fame. She refused to perform optimism she didn't feel, declined to offer false hope to other cancer patients, and insisted on discussing death as a natural part of life rather than a failure of positive thinking. Her appearances on television and radio during this period were unlike anything the entertainment industry had ever seen. Here was a former beauty queen who looked nothing like the woman who had competed at Miss Universe, speaking with brutal honesty about pain, fear, and the prospect of leaving behind a toddler daughter. She was using her final months to dismantle every comfortable lie that the beauty industry and cancer culture had built around suffering. The interviews were difficult to watch but impossible to forget. Eva, visibly weak and often struggling to speak above a whisper, would answer questions about her prognosis with the kind of directness that made seasoned journalists weep. When asked about her hopes for recovery, she would respond with statistics about her specific cancer type. When pressed to offer inspirational messages to other patients, she would talk about the importance of accepting reality rather than fighting it. But these conversations also revealed aspects of Eva's personality that her beauty queen years had never captured. Her sense of humor, dry and self-deprecating, emerged more clearly when she was freed from the obligation to be perpetually gracious. Her intelligence, no longer hidden behind pageant-appropriate responses, was evident in her analysis of everything from cancer treatment protocols to the psychology of terminal illness. Most importantly, her love for her daughter Miranda became the organizing principle of everything she said and did. Eva spoke openly about the agony of knowing she would miss her child's childhood, but she also talked about the gift of understanding exactly what mattered most. She was using her dying to teach Miranda lessons about courage, honesty, and the difference between being beautiful and being significant. The relationship with her husband John during this period was both heartbreaking and inspiring. He had married a beauty queen and was now caring for a dying woman, but his devotion never wavered because he had always seen past Eva's appearance to love the person beneath it. Their marriage became a public example of what love looked like when stripped of everything superficial and reduced to its essential elements. Eva's approach to her physical deterioration was characteristically unflinching. She continued to allow herself to be photographed and interviewed even as the cancer ravaged her appearance, even as she lost the beauty that had once defined her identity. She was proving that a person could literally lose everything the world valued about them and still be valuable, still be worthy of attention and respect and love. The medical establishment struggled with Eva's refusal to maintain hope in the face of increasingly dire prognoses. Doctors and nurses were accustomed to patients who fought their diseases with denial and determination. But Eva had moved beyond fighting to something more complex: acceptance, combined with purpose. She wasn't giving up. She was transforming her dying into a form of activism. Her advocacy work during this period focused on two main areas: improving cancer care in Venezuela and challenging cultural attitudes about female beauty and authenticity. She used her remaining public platform to raise money for treatment facilities while simultaneously questioning whether society's obsession with physical perfection was contributing to women's reluctance to seek medical care when their bodies showed signs of imperfection. The blog she maintained during her final months became required reading for cancer patients, medical professionals, and anyone struggling with their own relationship to mortality. Eva wrote with the same journalistic precision she had brought to her newspaper work, but now she was reporting on her own death in real time, documenting the process with a clarity that was both devastating and oddly comforting. Were these final decisions acts of surrender, or courageous acts of self-preservation of a different kind, preserving not her body but her integrity? Her final television appearance, recorded just weeks before her death, was a masterclass in grace under pressure. Eva, almost unrecognizable from the woman who had worn the Miss Venezuela crown 11 years earlier, spoke about death as if it were simply another phase of life rather than a tragedy to be feared. She discussed her preparations for dying, the letters she was writing for Miranda to read at different stages of her life, the financial arrangements she had made, the conversations she had had with John about raising their daughter as a single parent. But she also talked about unexpected gifts that her cancer had brought. The clarity that came from knowing exactly how much time she had left, the freedom from worry about aging or maintaining her appearance, and the profound satisfaction of finally being completely honest about everything that mattered. She had spent years trying to escape the limitations of being valued primarily for her beauty, and cancer had accomplished what years of journalism and advocacy could not. It had forced the world to see her as something other than just a beautiful face. The final weeks were spent at home, surrounded by family and focused entirely on the relationships that had sustained her throughout her illness. Eva was no longer giving interviews or maintaining her blog. She was using her remaining energy to love the people who had loved her when love required nothing but presence and attention. The vigil that developed around her home was unlike anything typically associated with celebrity death watches. People gathered not to witness the end of a famous person, but to honor someone who had used her fame to model a different way of being human. They brought flowers and cards, but they also brought stories about how Eva's honesty had given them permission to be honest about their own struggles with beauty, illness, and mortality. On December 17, 2011, Eva Ekvall died at home with her husband and daughter present. She was 28 years old, the same age as many of the beauty queens currently competing for the crowns she had once worn. But she had packed more authenticity and courage into her final 2 years than most people manage in a lifetime of health and conventional success. The woman who had once worried that she would only be remembered for her beauty had ensured that she would be remembered for something far more significant: the courage to tell the truth when truth was difficult, to remain authentic when authenticity was costly, and to transform her own suffering into a gift for others who were struggling with their own relationships to perfection, mortality, and meaning. December 17, 2011. The date marked not just the death of Eva Ekvall, but the completion of one of the most remarkable transformations in the history of celebrity culture. The woman who died that morning bore no physical resemblance to the beauty queen who had captivated Venezuela 11 years earlier. But she had become something far more significant than beautiful. She had become necessary. The news of her death spread across Latin America within hours, but the response was unlike typical celebrity obituaries. Instead of focusing on her pageant achievements or mourning the loss of her beauty, the tributes emphasized her courage, her honesty, and her refusal to let dying become another performance. Social media filled with photographs from Fuera de Foco, images of Eva bald and weak but radiantly authentic, rather than the glamorous pageant photos that had once defined her public image. The funeral in Caracas was attended by thousands of people who had never met Eva personally. but felt transformed by her example. Former beauty queens spoke about how her book had changed their understanding of their own careers and identities. Cancer patients credited her honesty with giving them permission to acknowledge their own fears and pain. Mothers talked about wanting to raise daughters who possessed Eva's kind of courage rather than her kind of beauty. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Miranda, barely 2 years old, was carried to her mother's coffin by her father. The little girl who would grow up without her mother's physical presence would instead inherit something more lasting. The example of someone who had chosen truth over comfort, authenticity over approval, and love over fear at every crucial moment of her short life. Was her death as straightforward as reported, or were powerful hidden forces involved? In Eva's case, the hidden forces were cultural and psychological, a beauty industry that taught women to value appearance over substance, a cancer culture that prioritized positive thinking over honest preparation for death, and a society that demanded women suffer prettily rather than use their suffering to create change. The immediate aftermath of her death revealed the scope of Eva's impact beyond Venezuela. Fuera de Foco was translated into multiple languages, becoming required reading in oncology programs and women's studies courses throughout Latin America and beyond. The photographs that had shocked people when the book was first published were now recognized as historically significant documents. Visual proof that beauty and authenticity were not only compatible, but that authenticity was, in fact, the highest form of beauty. But Eva's legacy was more complex than simple inspiration. She had forced uncomfortable questions about the relationship between female beauty and female value, about the way society treated illness and death, and about whether it was possible to live authentically in a culture built on carefully constructed lies. These questions didn't have simple answers, which made them more valuable rather than less. The foundation established in her name focused on two primary areas: improving cancer care for young women in Latin America and providing support for beauty pageant contestants struggling with the psychological costs of their careers. Both initiatives reflected Eva's understanding that individual suffering could be transformed into systemic change if approached with sufficient intelligence and determination. Her daughter Miranda, as she grew older, became the living embodiment of Eva's most important legacy. Raised by a father who had witnessed Eva's transformation firsthand and surrounded by people who had been touched by her example, Miranda was growing up with a radically different understanding of what it meant to be female in a culture obsessed with appearance. She was beautiful. Genetics had ensured that. But she was also being taught that beauty was the least interesting thing about her. The impact on Venezuela's beauty pageant culture was gradual but significant. Contestants began speaking more openly about the psychological pressures of competition, about eating disorders and depression, and the difficulty of maintaining perfect facades. Some credit Eva's example with creating space for beauty queens to be more human, more complex, and more honest about the costs of their success. But perhaps Eva's most lasting contribution was proving that it was possible to be simultaneously famous and authentic, to use celebrity as a platform for truth-telling rather than just self-promotion. She had demonstrated that people were hungry for honesty even when honesty was painful, that audiences could handle complexity even when complexity was uncomfortable. The annual tribute events held in her honor became gatherings focused not on mourning her death but on celebrating the way she had lived and died. Speakers would read passages from Fuera de Foco, display the photographs that had revolutionized how people thought about illness and beauty, and challenge attendees to consider how they might bring more of Eva's fearless authenticity to their own lives, what hidden secrets might still remain untold behind her public image. In Eva's case, there were no hidden secrets because she had refused to keep any. She had documented her thoughts, feelings, and experiences with journalistic precision. leaving behind a record of someone who had chosen transparency over privacy, honesty over image management, and truth over comfort at every opportunity. The medical community gradually recognized Eva's approach to terminal illness as a model for patient advocacy and death preparation. Her insistence on honest conversations about prognosis, her documentation of the cancer experience, and her refusal to perform false optimism had created a template for dying with dignity that influenced how doctors and families approached end-of-life care. The beauty industry's response was more complicated. Some companies and organizations embraced Eva's message about authentic beauty, launching campaigns that featured unretouched photographs and realistic beauty standards. But others continued to promote the same superficial ideals that had made Eva's journey toward authenticity so difficult and necessary. The publishing world took note of Fuera de Foco as proof that audiences were ready for more honest memoirs, more complex stories about female experience, and more books that prioritized truth over marketability. Eva had proven that people would buy honesty even when honesty was difficult to read, that authenticity could be commercially successful without being commercially compromised. As the years passed, Eva Ekvall's story became less about a beauty queen who died young and more about a woman who had figured out how to live authentically in a world designed to prevent authenticity. She had used her final years to model a different way of being female, a different way of being sick, and a different way of being human that emphasized courage over comfort and truth over image. The ultimate question that Eva's life and death raised, whether it was possible to maintain authenticity while achieving conventional success, had been answered through her example. She had proven that the two were not only compatible, but that authenticity was what transformed success from achievement into significance, from recognition into lasting impact. Eva Ekvall had been Miss Venezuela, but more importantly, she had been the first beauty queen to show that beauty was most powerful when it was used in service of truth. She had worn a crown for 1 year, but she had worn her courage for a lifetime, however brief that lifetime had been, and courage, unlike beauty, was something that could be inherited by anyone brave enough to claim it. In a culture built on beautiful lies, Eva Ekvall had lived and died a beautiful truth. That authenticity was the highest form of beauty, that honesty was the most effective form of love, and that the courage to be real in a world demanding perfection was the greatest gift one person could give to another. If Venezuela was still confused about the difference between being beautiful and being significant, they only had to remember Eva Ekvall. Venezuela gave Eva Ekvall a crown, cancer gave her the truth,